I am Jada, 34 years old, and the CEO of a luxury boutique hotel empire. I spent 5 years building my business from the ground up, only to realize I was also funding the grand illusion of a self-made mogul who happened to be my husband. While I was closing a massive European acquisition, my husband Marcus sent me a text that would finally sever the last string of my patience. He demanded his $3,000 allowance and threatened to divorce me if I did not comply. I simply took a sip of my champagne and texted back that I had already divorced him yesterday. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut a parasite out of your life to protect your peace and your assets. The night I finally reclaimed my life, I was standing on the expansive glass balcony of my Atlanta penthouse, looking down at the glittering city skyline. The city lights stretched out like a sea of diamonds, a reflection of the empire I had built with my own two hands. But to understand the sweet victory of that moment, I have to take you back to the grueling afternoon that started it all. I had just landed at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago after a punishing 14-hour flight from Paris. I was exhausted, running on empty after spending 4 days locked in intense negotiations to acquire a historic European property for my hotel chain. My feet ached in my designer heels, and my tailored suit felt like a suit of armor I was desperate to take off. I was the very picture of black excellence that magazines loved to feature, a self-made woman who had shattered glass ceilings. But behind the glossy magazine covers, I was carrying the dead weight of a husband who treated my bank accounts like his personal lottery winnings. I was standing near the baggage claim waiting for my driver when my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced at the screen expecting an update from my legal team. Instead, it was a message from Marcus. I opened the text, and the sheer audacity of his words made me freeze right there in the middle of the crowded terminal. "Why have you not sent my $3,000 allowance yet?" the text read. "I have investments to make and you are holding up my portfolio. Do you want me to get mad and divorce you?" I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Allowance. A grown 35-year-old man who proudly called himself an investment consultant was throwing a temper tantrum over his monthly allowance. For years, I had justified funding his lifestyle, telling myself that as a successful wife, it was my duty to support my husband's dreams. I had believed his empty promises of building a generational wealth portfolio. But looking at that threatening message, the veil completely lifted. He was not a partner. He was a parasite using my success to fund his ego. Instead of replying immediately, I opened my social media app and clicked on Marcus's profile. I needed a reminder of exactly what my hard-earned money was funding. His latest post was uploaded just 2 hours ago. It was a video of him popping a bottle of expensive champagne on a rented luxury yacht in Miami. He was wearing a custom linen suit paid for by my corporate card, surrounded by people I did not know. The caption read, "Self-made mogul moves grinding every day to build the empire." My jaw tightened. There was no grind. There was only my sweat, my sleepless nights, and my sacrifices funding his cinematic lifestyle. He was using the wealth I generated to play a successful businessman on the internet, all while threatening to divorce me if his allowance was late. The threat of divorce was his favorite weapon. Whenever I questioned his spending or asked to see the returns on his so-called investments, he would weaponize my dedication to our marriage. He knew society placed an immense burden on successful women to keep their homes together, to prove we could have it all. He used that pressure to keep my wallet open, but he had vastly underestimated the woman he married. He thought his threat would make me panic, that I would quickly transfer the funds and apologize for neglecting my matrimonial duties while on a business trip. He expected me to beg. I walked over to the airport lounge area, sat down in a quiet corner, and signaled for a glass of champagne from the attendant. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the crisp liquid cool the rising heat in my throat. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to scream or argue. I just felt a profound, chilling clarity. The time for protecting a one-sided marriage was officially over. I unlocked my phone, opened our message thread, and tapped the keyboard with steady, perfectly manicured fingers. I did not write a paragraph explaining how hard I worked. I did not beg him to understand my exhaustion. I simply typed 5 words that would change the trajectory of both our lives forever. I divorced you yesterday. I hit send. I watched the screen as the delivery notification popped up. Less than 10 seconds later, the typing indicator bubbles appeared, danced for a moment, and vanished. Then a single pathetic reply came through. I locked my phone and dropped it into my briefcase. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face. Marcus had no idea that while he was busy popping champagne and playing pretend mogul on a yacht, I had spent the last 72 hours executing a flawless legal strike. He thought he held all the power, but he was about to discover that threatening a woman who built her own empire is the most expensive mistake a man can ever make. I slipped my phone back into my briefcase, the sharp click of the clasp echoing the finality of my decision. My thumb hovered over the screen for just a fraction of a second before I pressed the power button, plunging the device into darkness. The heavy, stagnant air of the airport terminal suddenly felt different. I grabbed the handle of my luggage and began walking toward the exit. My posture was straight, my strides purposeful. I was no longer a woman rushing home to a parasitic husband. I was a chief executive officer who had just severed a massive liability from her portfolio. I navigated the sea of travelers, my mind already outlining the next phase of my strategy. I needed to get to my waiting car, get back to Atlanta, and secure my remaining physical assets. But as I rounded the corner past the baggage claim carousels, my forward momentum came to a sudden, jarring halt. Standing right in the middle of the walkway, blocking my path to the sliding glass doors, was Brittany. She was Marcus's white stepsister, a 30-year-old walking embodiment of unearned privilege. She was dressed in what she called bohemian chic, which essentially translated to $5,000 worth of designer linen that was intentionally wrinkled to look effortless. She had a matcha latte in one hand and her phone out in the other, tapping her foot with exaggerated impatience. When she spotted me, her face contorted into a mask of righteous indignation. She marched directly into my personal space, completely ignoring the fact that I had just stepped off a 14-hour international flight. Jada, finally, she announced, her voice pitched loud enough to turn the heads of the travelers walking past us. Marcus said you were landing an hour ago. I have been waiting here forever. I looked at her, my expression blank. I had not told Marcus or anyone in his family my exact flight details, which meant he had been tracking my corporate itinerary. "What are you doing in Chicago, Brittany?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly level. She huffed, rolling her eyes as if my question was a personal insult. "I am here for a wellness retreat, obviously. But that is not the point. The point is that my brand launch is in 2 weeks and Marcus promised me you would wire the $100,000 for my inventory by yesterday. The manufacturer is threatening to cancel my order. I need you to transfer the funds right now." I stared at her. $100,000. She was demanding a 6-figure sum for a holistic lifestyle brand that sold overpriced sage bundles and culturally appropriated healing crystals. And she was demanding it in the middle of an airport terminal as if I were a walking, automated teller machine. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase. "Brittany, I am not transferring a single cent to you. Now move out of my way." I stepped to the sides to bypass her, but she aggressively sidestepped to block me again. Her face flushed red, and her voice climbed an octave, adopting that specific shrill tone designed to paint me as the aggressor. "Excuse me," she snapped. "You do not get to speak to me like that. Marcus said you were acting crazy today, but this is ridiculous. We are family, Jada. You owe us this." I paused, letting a dangerous silence stretch between us. "I owe you," I repeated softly. She crossed her arms, leaning in closer, her voice dropping into a patronizing sneer. "Yes, you do. You seem to forget where you came from before you married my brother. My family embraced you. We elevated your urban background. We brought you into high society circles you never would have had access to. You are sitting on millions of dollars and you are acting this stingy over a tiny investment. It is honestly so ghetto." The word hung in the air. Urban, ghetto, the classic thinly veiled microaggressions she always used to remind me of my place. She looked around, playing to the invisible audience of onlookers, her eyes wide, performing the role of the innocent, terrified woman, dealing with an angry black woman. I felt the familiar heat of rage flare in my chest, the kind of rage I usually had to swallow to maintain my corporate composure. But today was different. The rules of engagement had changed the moment I sent that text to Marcus. I was no longer playing the accommodating wife trying to keep the peace with her husband's toxic entitled relatives. I took a slow, measured step toward her. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Instead, I invaded her personal space with an icy, terrifying calm that made her instinctively freeze. I looked down at the oversized, ridiculously expensive woven tote bag slung over her shoulder. A bag I knew for a fact cost $4,000. Without breaking eye contact, I reached my hand directly into her purse. "What are you doing?" she gasped, too shocked to pull away. My fingers brushed past her expensive cosmetics until I found exactly what I was looking for. I pulled out a sleek, heavy piece of metal. It was a platinum corporate credit card. My corporate credit card. The one Marcus had sworn he lost 3 months ago, but had secretly handed over to his stepsister to fund her wellness retreats and designer bags. Brittany paled, her mouth opening and closing in sudden panic. "You did not elevate anything, Brittany," I said, my voice barely a whisper but sharp as glass. "I built the table you are begging for crumbs from, and your free ride just expired." With one swift, forceful motion, I snapped the heavy platinum card perfectly in half. The sharp crack echoed over the dull roar of the terminal. I dropped the 2 pieces of useless metal into her matcha latte, watching the liquid splash over the rim. "Tell Marcus he is going to need a real job," I said. I stepped around her frozen, stunned body and walked out into the crisp Chicago air, leaving her speechless in the middle of the baggage claim. The automatic doors slid open, welcoming me into a brand new chapter of my life. A chapter where I held all the cards and the parasites were finally cut loose. I took a deep breath of the cool, unconditioned air, feeling a massive weight lift off my tired shoulders. The moment my heels hit the pavement outside the arrivals terminal, my private driver David was already pulling the black SUV up to the curb. He stepped out immediately to take my luggage, his professional demeanor unfazed by the commotion I had just left behind me inside the airport. Through the heavy glass doors, I could still see Brittany throwing a spectacular tantrum, waving the 2 pieces of the platinum card at a bewildered airport security guard. She was screaming something, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic, but the thick, soundproof glass of my vehicle severed her voice from my reality. I slid into the supple leather of the back seat, the heavy door thudding shut behind me and sealing me in a quiet, temperature-controlled cocoon. "Take us home, David," I instructed, leaning back and closing my eyes for just a fraction of a second. "Right away, Ms. Vance," he replied smoothly, merging the heavy vehicle seamlessly into the brutal Chicago traffic. But rest was a luxury I could not afford just yet. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my secondary phone, a secure line dedicated exclusively to my legal and financial team. I dialed the direct number for my lead attorney, a ruthless, brilliant woman named Patricia, who handled my corporate acquisitions, and as of recently, my personal extraction. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me it is done," I said, skipping the formalities completely. "It is done," Patricia confirmed, her voice crisp and echoing perfectly through the secure connection. The paperwork was filed exactly as we planned. I let out a slow, steady breath. The relief was palpable, but it was quickly overshadowed by the cold, burning necessity of absolute retribution. To understand the sheer magnitude of what Patricia and I had accomplished, you have to understand what I had uncovered just 72 hours prior. I had been sitting in a lavish suite in Paris, drinking espresso and reviewing the quarterly financial audits for my hospitality brand. My chief financial officer had flagged a minor discrepancy in the property tax filings for our flagship location, the very first luxury hotel I had built from the ground up right in the heart of Atlanta. It was supposed to be a routine administrative error, Instead, it unraveled a staggering web of financial deceit. I had ordered a deep dive into the property records, tracing a bizarre thread of unauthorized liens. What I found made my blood run absolutely cold. Marcus had forged my signature. My husband, the man who slept next to me, who kissed me goodbye before my flight, had meticulously falsified my biometric approval and corporate seal to bypass our internal security protocols. He did not just siphon money from a discretionary fund. He used my flagship property, a hotel valued at $40 million, as collateral for a massive secret commercial loan. I asked Patricia to verify the destination of those stolen funds. It took her forensic accounting team less than a day to trace the money. Marcus had used the capital to purchase a sprawling multi-million-dollar real estate compound hidden under a shell company. He was building his own independent empire using the bricks he stole from mine. And the most insulting part was that he thought I was too busy being a globe-trotting chief executive officer to notice the missing foundation. We have successfully secured the original forged documents, Patricia continued, pulling my focus back to the present moment. Our cybersecurity team intercepted the digital trails of his unauthorized transfers before he could scrub the metadata. He is completely exposed, Jada. He has absolutely no idea we have the evidence locked away in a secure server. I smiled, watching the city skyline blur past the tinted windows of the SUV. He thinks he is a master manipulator, I replied, my voice steady. He thinks because I travel so much I am oblivious to the details of my own wealth. He mistook my trust for stupidity. That brings us to the divorce filings, Patricia said, shifting gears with surgical precision. As you requested, we bypassed the standard public family court docket. We filed the dissolution of marriage under a sealed corporate alias tied to a subsidiary holding company. It is a perfectly legal maneuver designed to protect high net worth individuals from immediate public scrutiny. The judge signed off on the confidentiality agreement this morning. Marcus will not receive the official service of process until we decide to drop the hammer. Right now, he genuinely believes he is still safely married to his golden goose. Excellent work, Patricia, I said, feeling a genuine surge of triumph. Let him enjoy his yacht parties and his borrowed luxury for a few more hours. I want him completely blindsided when the reality of his situation finally hits. We wrapped up the call discussing the final parameters of the asset protection strategy. As I ended the connection, I leaned back against the headrest, ready to finally allow myself a moment of rest. The hardest part was over. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the parasite was legally severed from my life. I watched the highway stretch out before us, calculating exactly how I would handle Marcus when I walked through the front doors of my estate. But the quiet peace of the car was suddenly broken by the sharp, unexpected chime of the navigation dashboard. David, my driver, tapped the screen, his professional posture suddenly growing tense. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Ms. Vance." I apologize for the interruption, he said, his voice tight with concern. I just tried to route our refueling stop through the corporate account, but the system is showing an error. I sat up, my strategic mindset instantly clicking back into high gear. What kind of error, David? He tapped the screen again, verifying the message before speaking. The company gas card was just declined, he reported, his tone grave. The alert says a hard freeze has been placed on the account. I quickly pulled out my primary phone and opened my banking application, only to be met with a glaring red notification banner. Someone had just initiated a total lockdown on all of my domestic financial accounts. The notification on David's dashboard hung in the air like a physical weight, but I did not let panic overtake me. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared, and I was anything but. I instructed David to continue toward my estate in Buckhead, maintaining a smooth, even tone. The hard freeze on my domestic accounts was a bold move, but it was also a sloppy one. Marcus was showing his hand too early. He was playing checkers while I had already flipped the entire chessboard. The drive through the winding, tree-lined streets of my exclusive Atlanta neighborhood usually brought me a sense of deep peace. I had purchased my sprawling 8-bedroom estate before I even met Marcus. It was my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of every late night and sacrificed weekend. But as David guided the heavy sport utility vehicle around the final bend and my property came into view, that peace instantly evaporated. My private gated driveway was completely overrun. A fleet of flashy, unfamiliar luxury cars was parked haphazardly across the manicured cobblestones. There were neon-wrapped sports cars and oversized trucks that screamed of new, unearned money. I could feel the deep bass of loud music vibrating through the heavy glass windows of my vehicle. Marcus was not just home. He was throwing a massive, chaotic party. David put the vehicle in park and immediately unbuckled his seatbelt to assist me, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Stay in the car, David," I instructed, my voice deadly calm. "Keep the engine running." I stepped out into the humid evening air. The sheer disrespect radiating from my own home was staggering. I walked up the wide stone steps to my custom mahogany front door, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I reached out to the digital smart lock keypad, inputting the 6-digit access code I had used for years. The screen blinked red. A sharp mechanical beep signaled that access was denied. I tried again. Denied. Marcus had actually changed the security codes to my own house. Before I could reach for the master biometric override hidden beneath the keypad, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Marcus stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance with his broad shoulders. He was wearing a velvet smoking jacket that I had bought him for his birthday, holding a crystal glass filled to the brim with a vintage red wine from my private cellar. A wine that cost more per bottle than he had earned in his entire life. Behind him, the foyer was a circus. His freeloading friends were lounging on my imported Italian furniture, laughing loudly and toasting to his upcoming wealth. They were celebrating his new status as a self-made millionaire, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing in a castle built entirely by a black woman. Marcus looked down at me, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He looked like a man who believed he had just checkmated a grandmaster. "Look who finally decided to come home," he slurred slightly, taking a lazy sip of the stolen wine. "You are locked out, Jada. You do not live here anymore." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to compete with the thumping bass echoing from the living room. I simply looked at him, my face a mask of absolute indifference. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Marcus?" I asked smoothly. He chuckled, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the front door nearly shut behind him to muffle the noise of his parasitic friends. He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He waved them in front of my face like a winning lottery ticket. "I am taking what is mine," he declared, puffing out his chest. "I filed for emergency spousal support this morning. I also seized control of all our joint and primary domestic accounts. You are locked out of your own money, Jada. Your cards are useless." I watched him perform, letting him inflate his own ego. "And on what grounds did a judge grant this emergency order?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. His grin widened into something truly repulsive. "Abandonment," he stated proudly. "I told the court that you abandoned your matrimonial duties by flying off to Europe. I filed a sworn affidavit stating that your constant business trips left me financially vulnerable, emotionally distressed, and entirely dependent. The judge agreed that I needed immediate financial protection to maintain the marital standard of living while you were out globetrotting." The sheer audacity of his lie was almost impressive. He had weaponized the legal system by playing the role of the neglected, victimized spouse. He was using the very business trips that funded his luxurious lifestyle as the weapon to steal my assets. He thought he had trapped me outside my own gates with no money, no leverage, and no power. "You really think this piece of paper protects you?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "You think changing the locks on a door changes who holds the deed to the land?" Marcus scoffed, taking another greedy gulp of my vintage wine. "I know it protects me. I am the man of this house, and I am the one running things now. I have 50% of everything you own, Jada. Your hotels, your bank accounts, this estate. It all belongs to me too. So unless you want me to drag your name through the mud and ruin your pristine corporate reputation, you are going to walk back to your little car and wait until I am ready to negotiate." He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. He was drunk on stolen wine and borrowed power. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cry, to beg for access to my own home, to panic over my frozen bank accounts. He wanted the satisfaction of watching a powerful woman crumble at his feet. But I just stared at him, absorbing every ounce of his delusion. I did not care about the frozen domestic accounts, because the bulk of my liquid wealth had already been routed through offshore holding companies during my European acquisitions. I did not care about the legal papers in his hand, because they were based on a marriage that no longer legally existed. He was guarding a fortress that was already scheduled for demolition. I let the silence stretch between us, allowing the cool night breeze to sweep across the porch. The party roared on behind him, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to collapse. I held his gaze, my expression completely unbothered, preparing to deliver the next phase of his destruction. The cool night breeze swept across the porch, carrying the heavy scent of Marcus's expensive cologne, mixed with the rich aroma of my stolen vintage wine. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to shatter. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the tears, the screaming, the desperate pleading that would validate his fragile masculinity. I gave him absolutely nothing. I simply stared at him, my silence stripping away the false bravado he was trying so hard to project. But before the reality of my indifference could fully penetrate his alcohol-soaked brain, the heavy mahogany door was pulled open wider from the inside. The loud thumping bass of the party spilled out onto the porch, bringing with it a wave of laughter and the clinking of glasses. And stepping out into the warm evening air, looking entirely too comfortable in my home, was Brittany. I felt a sharp, dangerous stillness settle over my entire body. Brittany was not just trespassing in my house. She was wearing my clothes. And not just any piece of clothing. She was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that I had commissioned from an independent designer in Milan. It was a garment constructed specifically for my measurements, a piece of art that draped perfectly over my skin. On Brittany, it looked ill-fitting and cheap. It was dragging slightly on the stone porch, the delicate hem brushing against the dirt. She was holding a cocktail glass, swaying slightly, completely oblivious to the sheer violation of walking out of my master bedroom wearing my personal belongings. When she saw me standing on the steps, she let out a loud, exaggerated gasp. She turned her head back toward the foyer, raising her voice so that the crowd of freeloading guests inside could hear every single word she said. "Oh my goodness. Everyone look who decided to show up and ruin the vibe," Brittany announced, her voice dripping with that signature weaponized fragility. "It is Jada!" And she looks absolutely furious. Marcus, be careful, she looks like she is about to get aggressive again. The chatter inside the foyer dipped into a hushed collective murmur. A few people snickered. Brittany turned back to me, wearing a deeply patronizing smile. She took a sip of her drink, a drop of the pink liquid dangerously close to spilling onto the emerald silk of my gown. She stepped up beside Marcus, looping her arm through his, presenting a united front of unearned entitlement. "You really need to calm down, Jada," Brittany said, projecting her voice to ensure the audience inside caught her performance as the rational peacemaker. "You always do this. You fly off the handle and create this hostile environment whenever you do not get your way. You are being so loud and combative right now, and honestly, it is making everyone here feel very unsafe." I had not spoken a single word. I had not raised my voice by a fraction of a decibel. Yet here she was, expertly painting me as the angry, irrational black woman to justify their blatant theft. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a script she had rehearsed her entire life. She was using my silent presence as a blank canvas to project her own calculated victimhood. I kept my hands resting easily at my sides. I looked at the hem of my silk dress dragging on the stone, then brought my gaze up to meet her pale, defiant eyes. Brittany, seemingly emboldened by my lack of a verbal response, took a step closer to the edge of the porch. She tilted her head, adopting a tone of fake sisterly concern that made my stomach turn. Listen, Jada, we all know you are the face of the brand. She continued, waving her cocktail glass through the air. You do the interviews, you wear the nice suits, and you play the part of the boss very well. But let us be completely honest with ourselves here. Marcus has the superior business mind. He has the actual strategy, the vision, the pedigree to take this hospitality chain to the next level. You are just too emotional to handle the pressure of high-stakes real estate. It is too much for someone from your background. She sighed dramatically as if she were delivering difficult but necessary medical news to a terminal patient. You really need to step down from your role as Chief Executive Officer, Jada. You are ruining the classy image of the company with all this erratic behavior. Just sign the papers Marcus is holding. Take the generous settlement he is offering, step back gracefully, and let the real professionals handle the corporate aesthetics. If you keep fighting this, you are only going to embarrass yourself in front of the board. The sheer delusion radiating from the two of them was almost suffocating. They actually believed this narrative. Marcus believed his fraudulent paperwork made him a king, and Brittany believed her proximity to his delusion made her royalty. They had convinced themselves that they were the architects of my empire, completely ignoring the fact that they were nothing more than termites feasting on the wooden beams I had carried on my own back. Marcus smirked, clearly enjoying the backup. You heard her, Jada. It is time to let the adults run the show. Go back to your car. I did not argue. I did not waste my breath trying to educate a parasite on the biology of its host. I simply took a slow, deliberate step forward. Marcus instinctively stiffened, but I did not look at him. I walked right past him, stepping directly onto the threshold of my own home. Brittany shrank back against the doorframe as I passed her, false bravado faltering for a split second as I invaded her personal space. The scent of my stolen perfume radiating off her skin made my jaw clench, but I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. I walked into the grand foyer. The music was still vibrating through the floors. The crowd of strangers holding my crystal glasses went completely silent as I moved through them like a ghost. They parted instinctively, stepping out of my way, sensing the lethal quiet energy rolling off my shoulders. I did not look at a single one of them. I walked directly down the main corridor, past the sweeping grand staircase, toward a section of the wall that appeared to be nothing more than smooth, seamless oak paneling. It was a feature the original architects had designed specifically for my security protocols. I stopped in front of the blank wood. I raised my right hand, extended my thumb, and pressed it firmly against a hidden biometric scanner embedded invisibly into the grain of the wood. The panel instantly recognized my fingerprint and emitted a soft, confirming chime. The soft chime was the only warning anyone got. Before Marcus could even turn his head, the master override executed my command with ruthless efficiency. The heavy, thumping bass, shaking the foundation of my home, cut out so abruptly that the sudden silence physically hurt. A split second later, every single light in the sprawling mansion went completely dark. The grand crystal chandelier, the ambient living room, lighting the exterior illumination, all extinguished in a single breath. The estate was plunged into a heavy darkness, illuminated only by faint moonlight spilling through the massive windows. But I did not stop at the lights. My thumb remained pressed against the biometric scanner, navigating the invisible digital menu I knew by heart. With a second deliberate press, I severed power to the commercial-grade heating and ventilation units. The low hum of the central air died away. In the sweltering heat of an Atlanta evening, the packed house would become intolerably uncomfortable within minutes. With a third press, I triggered the main utility shutoff valves. Deep within the walls, the primary water lines sealed themselves shut. The luxurious rainfall showers and imported marble sinks ran completely dry. I cut off the life support of the entire property, stripping away every ounce of comfort these parasites enjoyed. For a moment, the foyer was trapped in stunned confusion. The chorus of laughter died instantly, replaced by chaotic murmurs of dozens of uninvited guests stumbling in the dark. Cell phone flashlights clicked on, casting erratic beams of harsh white light across my imported Italian marble floors. I heard the panicked voices of Marcus's friends bumping into furniture, asking what just happened. Marcus stood frozen near the front door, his silhouette illuminated by the sweeping beams of phone lights. It took his alcohol-soaked brain a few seconds to process that the power outage was a targeted, surgical strike. When his eyes locked onto my figure standing calmly by the oak paneling, the mask of the untouchable mogul evaporated. "You crazy woman!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking with sudden rage. He lunged away from the entryway, storming across the foyer toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing in the dark. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under that ridiculous velvet jacket. When he was just a few feet away, he violently hurled his crystal wine glass straight at the wall beside my head. The glass shattered explosively against the oak paneling, sending a spray of expensive red wine and razor-sharp shards raining down just inches from my heels. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting easily at my sides, watching him unravel exactly as I knew he would. "Turn the power back on Jada," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to ruin my event. Turn it back on right now, or I swear I will make you regret ever walking through that door." I just looked at him, my silence an impenetrable fortress. I was not going to negotiate with a squatter in my own home. Brittany, who had been cowering near the staircase when the lights went out, shrieked as the glass shattered. She scrambled toward Marcus, clutching my silk gown tightly around her waist, as if she needed protection from me. "Marcus, do something," she whined, her voice pitching into that familiar tone of weaponized victimhood. "She is acting completely unhinged. We cannot have her in here terrorizing our guests. Get her out of here." Marcus nodded, his eyes wild with fury. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, the bright screen illuminating his sweating, furious face. He tapped the screen aggressively, his breathing jagged in the quiet hallway. "You want to play games, Jada?" he spat, holding the phone to his ear. "Let us see how tough you are when the police show up and drag your trespassing self out in handcuffs." I listened as the emergency dispatcher answered his call. Marcus immediately altered his voice, dropping the aggressive screaming tone he had just used with me. He shifted seamlessly into the role of a terrified, law-abiding citizen dealing with a dangerous intruder. "Yes, I need immediate assistance at my residence," Marcus said into the phone, his voice trembling with manufactured fear. "My estranged wife just broke into my house. She is acting highly erratic and extremely aggressive. She has somehow cut the power to the entire property, and she is threatening the safety of my guests. Yes, we are locked in the dark with her. Please hurry. She is completely out of control, and I fear for our safety." He rattled off my address, painting a vivid, calculated picture of an unhinged black woman terrorizing a peaceful gathering. It was a deeply insidious move, tapping directly into systemic biases to ensure an escalated, forceful police response. He ended the call and glared at me, a nasty, triumphant sneer returning to his face. "They are on their way," he mocked, crossing his arms. "You just crossed the line from a civil dispute into a criminal trespassing charge. You are going to leave this estate in the back of a squad car." I remained rooted to the spot, perfectly still in the darkness. I did not try to turn the power back on or argue my case to the panicking guests filtering into the hallway with their phones. I simply waited. The heavy, humid air of the unconditioned house was already beginning to stifle the room, but my focus was entirely fixed on the sounds outside. Then it started. Faint at first, but growing rapidly louder, the sharp wail of police sirens began to cut through the quiet night. Red and blue lights started to reflect off the tall trees, flashing ominously through the glass. The stage was set for a highly tense, legally explosive standoff. He had absolutely no idea the police were about to become the audience to his ultimate destruction. Red and blue patrol lights pierced my towering front windows, casting spinning shadows across the dark foyer. Heavy pounding on my front door echoed through the silent house. Marcus scrambled to answer, footsteps splashing slightly in the spilled wine. He threw the door open, raising his hands in a posture of manufactured relief. Two police officers stepped inside, their boots thudding against the marble. Their flashlight beams swept across the unlit room, landing squarely on me. I stood exactly where I had been, my posture straight, hands resting visibly at my sides. I did not blink against the harsh glare. I knew how this scene looked to them: a sweltering mansion, a broken glass shattered against the wall, a panicked man at the door, and a calm, unsmiling black woman standing in the shadows. Before Marcus could utter a single word to set his narrative, Brittany launched into the performance of a lifetime. She threw herself toward the officers, stumbling dramatically over my silk gown. Genuine-looking tears streamed down her pale cheeks. Her shoulders shook with manufactured sobs. She wrapped her arms around herself as if freezing despite the suffocating heat of the unconditioned house. "Thank God you are here!" Brittany cried out, her voice quivering with absolute terror. "She is completely out of control. We were having a peaceful dinner, and she barged in here and went crazy. She cut the power and trapped us in the dark." The lead officer immediately softened his stance as Brittany approached him. He holstered his flashlight and held up a hand to calm her, his protective instincts instantly activated by her display of weaponized fragility. It was a dynamic I had seen play out in corporate boardrooms 1,000 times before. Her white tears were an absolute currency, and she was cashing them in to buy my destruction. "You are safe now," the officer said soothingly. "Take a deep breath and tell me exactly what happened here." Brittany let out a ragged sob, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "She is Marcus' estranged wife. She has been acting aggressive and hostile lately. She came in screaming and hit the security panel to lock us inside. Then she started throwing things. Look at the wall." She gestured to the shattered crystal and the pool of vintage red wine staining the oak paneling. Marcus chimed in on cue, adopting a tone of terrified resignation. I tried to calm her down. Officer Marcus lied smoothly, putting a comforting arm around Brittany. I showed her the legal paperwork. "The judge granted me emergency spousal support and control of the property today because of her erratic behavior." But she snapped. She threw that glass right at my head. We feared for our lives. We thought she had a weapon in the dark. The mechanics of their lie were flawless. They used all the right trigger words: aggressive, hostile, erratic, feared for our lives. They painted me as a violent threat, tapping directly into the deepest, most dangerous systemic biases these officers carried. The empathy they had just shown Brittany vanished the moment they turned their attention back to me. Their postures stiffened. The second officer casually rested his hand on his utility belt, preparing for an altercation they had been told was inevitable. The lead officer approached me, closing the distance with heavy steps. He stopped a few feet away, his expression hard and unyielding. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not ask if I actually lived there. The narrative had already been decided. "I need you to step away from the wall and keep your hands where I can see them," the officer commanded, his voice dripping with authority. I kept my hands perfectly still. "Officer, I am standing in my own home," I replied, my tone remaining smooth and unbothered. "Not according to the homeowner here," the officer snapped back, gesturing to Marcus. "He says he has a court order granting him possession of the property, and he says you are trespassing and causing a domestic disturbance. Given the broken glass and the clear distress of the guests in this house, I am ordering you to step outside immediately. If you refuse to comply, I will put you in handcuffs and remove you by force. Do you understand me?" Behind the officer, Marcus failed to hide a massive, triumphant grin. He pulled Brittany a little closer, playing the protective hero while he watched the police do his dirty work. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully weaponized the law to humiliate me and kick me out of the empire I had built. The small crowd of party guests huddled in the background, whispering and holding up their phones, waiting to record my inevitable messy downfall. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the officer about the broken glass or the fake tears. Trying to shout over a lie only makes you look exactly like the angry stereotype they are desperate to see. Instead, I maintained my absolute terrifying calm. "I understand that perfectly, officer," I said softly. I slowly and deliberately reached to the leather briefcase resting by my feet. The second officer tensed visibly, but I moved with such measured precision that they did not intervene. I popped the brass clasps and reached inside. I bypassed my secondary phone and my travel documents. My fingers found exactly what I had prepared for this very moment. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed with a tamper-proof corporate sticker and carried the embossed stamp of the county clerk. I held it out by the very edge, offering it to the lead officer. Before you decide to place me in handcuffs for trespassing, I suggest you read the contents of this envelope. I said, my eyes locking directly onto his. Because the man standing behind you is not the homeowner. And quite frankly, neither am I, officer. The lead officer took the heavy manila envelope from my outstretched hand. He looked down at the thick corporate seal and the tamper-proof sticker holding the flap closed. For a moment he hesitated, his training conflicting with the undeniable legitimacy of the legal document I had just handed him. He holstered his flashlight, slid his thumb under the flap, and broke the seal. The crisp rustle of the thick parchment paper seemed to echo loudly in the sudden tense silence of the foyer. Marcus shifted his weight on the porch steps, his velvet jacket catching the spinning red and blue lights of the police cruisers. He crossed his arms defensively. "Do not let her trick you." Officer Marcus called out, his voice dripping with forced bravado. "She is always pulling stunts like this. She is probably handing you some fake corporate jargon to confuse you. Just put her in the back of the car. She is a danger to my guests." Brittany nodded vigorously beside him, clutching my emerald silk gown tighter around her waist. "She is a total fraud," Brittany chimed in, leaning over the porch railing. "You cannot trust a word she says. She thinks she is above the law just because she has a little bit of money." I kept my eyes locked on the lead officer. I watched as his gaze scanned the first page of the document. I watched the hard, authoritative line of his jaw slowly slacken. I watched his eyes dart to the second page, scanning the raised, embossed stamp of the Fulton County clerk. The aggressive, defensive posture he had adopted when dealing with me completely evaporated. He lowered the document, let out a long, slow breath, and turned his head to look directly at Marcus. "Sir," the officer began, his tone entirely stripped of its previous warmth, "did you state earlier that you are the lawful owner of this residence?" Marcus puffed out his chest, stepping forward with unearned confidence. "It is marital property," Marcus lied smoothly. "I have a court order from a judge granting me emergency possession of the estate and freezing her assets. She has no right to be here." The officer shook his head slowly, holding up the document for Marcus to see. "I do not know what kind of court order you think you have," the officer said flatly. "But according to this certified deed, which was officially recorded and stamped by the county clerk this morning, this property is not marital property. In fact, it is not a private residence at all." Marcus froze. The arrogant smirk wiped clean off his face in an instant. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, stepping down onto the bottom step. I took a measured step forward, reclaiming the physical space in my own courtyard. "I will explain it to him, officer," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I turned my gaze to Marcus, letting him feel the full crushing weight of my absolute composure. "You see, Marcus, I woke up very early this morning in my suite in Paris. While you were sleeping off a hangover in my bed and planning how to steal my bank accounts, I was on a secure video call with my legal team and the board of directors for a very special organization." Brittany let out a nervous, breathy laugh. "What organization?" she demanded, her voice pitching higher. "The Atlanta Youth Excellence Initiative," I stated proudly. "It is a highly respected nonprofit rehabilitation program dedicated to providing housing, trade skills, and intensive mentorship for at-risk Black teenagers across the city. It is a cause I have supported for years. And this morning, at exactly 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, I legally donated this entire $4 million estate to their foundation." The silence that followed was absolute. The background murmurs of the freeloading party guests clustered in the doorway died completely. The night air suddenly felt thick and suffocating. "You did what?" Marcus gasped, the blood draining completely from his face. Brittany stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in pure horror. "You gave away a mansion!" Brittany shrieked, her weaponized fragility shattering into genuine, unfiltered panic. "You cannot do that. This is a luxury estate in Buckhead. You cannot just turn it into a center for criminals. That is illegal. Marcus is your husband. He has rights to this house." I turned my attention to Brittany, my eyes narrowing just enough to let her know I was done playing nice. Do not ever refer to marginalized youth as criminals in my presence again, Brittany, I said, my voice slicing through the humid air like a blade. And you might want to brush up on your property law before you try to steal from a black woman who built her wealth from the ground up. This estate was purchased entirely by my single-member corporate entity 3 years before I ever made the mistake of introducing your brother to my tax bracket. My name is the only name that has ever touched that deed. It was never commingled, and he has absolutely zero legal claim to it. Marcus shook his head frantically, pulling his crumpled emergency court order from his jacket pocket. He waved the papers wildly in the air. That does not matter, he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. I filed an emergency injunction today. The judge froze your assets. You cannot give away property when there is an active financial freeze. I smiled. It was a slow, terrifying smile that finally made Marcus realize he was drowning. You are absolutely right, Marcus, I replied calmly. An emergency injunction does freeze assets. But let us look at the timeline, shall we? Your lawyer filed that injunction at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The judge signed it at 3. My legal team executed the philanthropic property transfer and recorded it with the county clerk at 8 o'clock this morning. By the time your little emergency order went into effect, this house had already been off my books for 6 hours. You froze in empty space. Marcus stumbled backward, hitting the porch railing. He looked down at the court documents in his hands as if they had suddenly caught fire. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had locked me out of a house I did not even own anymore. The lead officer cleared his throat, handing the deed back to me. Ma'am, your documentation is in order, the officer said respectfully. He turned to look at Marcus, his hand resting on his radio. Sir, this is no longer a domestic dispute. This is a commercial property owned by a non-profit organization. You have no legal right to restrict access, and technically, you and your guests are currently trespassing on charity grounds. The police department cannot enforce a family court eviction on a property owned by a third party. Brittany began to hyperventilate, clutching the emerald silk of my gown. Marcus, do something, she cried out. Where are we supposed to go? I stepped closer to the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the two parasites who thought they could outsmart me. That is a wonderful question, Brittany, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet night. Because the director of the charity is incredibly eager to begin transforming this property into their new community center. In fact, their demolition and renovation crew consists of 50 young men who are very motivated to start their new jobs. They will be arriving here with sledgehammers, dumpsters, and bulldozers at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I let my eyes drag slowly over Marcus's trembling frame, savoring the absolute terror radiating from his body. You and your uninvited guests have exactly until dawn to get off their property. I suggest you start packing. I turned my back on their stunned silence, walking gracefully to the waiting black sport utility vehicle. David opened the door, and as I slid into the quiet leather interior, I did not look back at the chaotic porch. I slept that night in the penthouse suite of my downtown property, enjoying 8 uninterrupted hours of perfect rest. I knew Marcus and his sister were spending those exact same hours, frantically hauling their cheap luggage out of a house that no longer belonged to them, watching their illusion of high society crumble before the sun even rose. By 9 o'clock the next morning, I was stepping into the executive boardroom at my corporate headquarters. The room was a sanctuary of power enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Seated around the massive mahogany table were the 7 members of my board of directors. We were halfway through a standard quarterly revenue review when the heavy double doors at the back of the room were violently thrown open. Marcus stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, flanked by 2 confused security guards who were desperately trying to hold him back. He looked completely unhinged. The velvet smoking jacket from the night before had been replaced by a wrinkled business suit. His eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night of forced relocation, and his tie was slightly askew. Despite his disheveled appearance, he carried a thick leather binder tucked under his arm, holding onto it like a lifeline. He was running on pure, toxic desperation. Ms. Vance. I am so sorry, The lead security guard panted, gripping Marcus by the elbow. He shoved his way past the reception desk before we could intercept him. Should we call the local authorities? I raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stand down. I looked at Marcus, taking in his manic energy. Let him go, I said smoothly. I think my estranged husband has something he desperately needs to share with the board. Marcus wrenched his arm away from the guard, straightening his jacket with a scoff. He marched into the room as if he owned the entire building, his footsteps heavy against the carpet. He stopped at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, facing me directly. The board members watched in stunned silence, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden domestic intrusion into a high-level corporate environment. "You thought you won last night," Marcus announced, his voice carrying a jagged edge of hysteria. "You thought you could kick me out into the street and humiliate me in front of my friends. But you forgot one very important detail, Jada. You do not own this empire by yourself." He slammed the heavy leather binder down onto the polished wood table. The loud smack made a few of the board members jump. He flipped it open, pulling out a crisp, freshly printed legal document and tossing it toward the center of the table for everyone to see. "That is an executed prenuptial agreement," Marcus declared, puffing out his chest and addressing the confused executives. "And it clearly outlines that in the event of a marital dissolution or formal separation, I am entitled to exactly 50% of all corporate holdings, intellectual property, and liquid assets tied to this hospitality brand. You tried to hide it, but the law is the law. I own half of this company." I did not touch the paper. I simply leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. "Marcus, we both know we never signed a prenuptial agreement," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. "You refused to sign one 5 years ago because you claimed it would ruin the romance of our wedding day. Whatever document you just printed at the local copy center this morning is a blatant forgery." Marcus laughed, a harsh grating sound that filled the boardroom. "It has your signature on it, Jada. It has the notary stamp. You can deny it all you want, but it will hold up in court long enough to freeze every single corporate asset you rely on. While you are busy fighting a lengthy legal battle to prove it is fake, this entire company will bleed out. The stock will plummet. The investors will flee. You will lose everything." He leaned over the table, planting his hands firmly on the wood, his eyes burning with vindictive triumph. "Unless, of course, the board does the smart thing and removes the liability." The room was incredibly still. Marcus turned his gaze away from me, looking directly at two specific men seated on the right side of the table. Gregory and William. They were two of my oldest board members' men who had recently expressed frustration over my aggressive expansion strategies because it cut into their short-term quarterly dividends. I have already had extensive conversations with Gregory, and William. Marcus revealed a smug, venomous smile spreading across his face. "They agree that your recent behavior is entirely too erratic to sustain corporate stability. They agree that a lengthy public divorce battle involving frozen assets is a risk this company cannot afford to take." Gregory cleared his throat, adjusting his tie without making eye contact with me. "Jada, we have a fiduciary duty to protect the shareholders." Gregory muttered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "If your husband truly holds documentation that could trap this brand in a prolonged legal freeze, we have to consider alternative leadership to maintain market confidence." William nodded in agreement, suddenly finding his notepad incredibly fascinating. "The public relations nightmare alone would be catastrophic," William added. "We cannot have a chief executive officer entangled in federal property disputes and spousal asset freezes." Marcus stood tall, soaking in their cowardly betrayal. He felt invincible. He had successfully weaponized the innate sexism of the corporate world, using the threat of a messy divorce to label me as a hysterical, unstable woman who was unfit to lead. He had bought out 2 of my board members with promises of higher dividends and a more compliant chief executive officer once I was ousted. "I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence," Marcus demanded, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I have the backing to strip you of your title right now, Jada. You are going to step down, hand over the reins, and walk away with whatever fraction of the company I decide to let you keep. If you refuse, I will lock this entire brand in litigation until it burns to the ground." He thought he had me cornered. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect corporate coup, using forged papers and spineless allies to steal the empire I had built with my own blood and sweat. He expected me to panic, to plead with the board to try and defend my signature on his fake document. Instead, I let a heavy, terrifying silence stretch across the room. I looked at Gregory, then at William, and finally locked my eyes entirely on Marcus. I slowly unclasped my hands and reached for the touchscreen panel embedded in the table directly in front of me. I was not going to defend a forged prenuptial agreement. I was going to show them exactly why they should never have brought a knife to a nuclear fight. The low murmur of hushed voices began to ripple across the mahogany table. Gregory and William exchanged confident, validating glances with the other board members, attempting to quickly build a consensus for my removal. They were trying to manufacture a panic, whispering about stock prices, public relations disasters, and the necessity of immediate action to save the brand. Marcus stood at the end of the table, soaking in their cowardly compliance. His chest was puffed out, a triumphant sneer resting heavily on his face as he waited for the gavel to fall on my career. He honestly thought his fabricated crisis was working. I remained seated in my high-backed leather chair, completely unfazed by the theatrical display. I brought my hands together, resting my elbows on the table and steepling my fingers. I let the anxious chatter fill the room for a full 60 seconds. I wanted every single executive in that room to publicly commit to their panic before I completely dismantled it. When the murmurs reached a fever pitch, and William opened his mouth to officially call for a vote of no confidence, I finally made my move. I did not raise my voice. I did not act like a woman backed into a corner. I simply tapped the sleek glass control panel embedded in the table directly in front of me. The heavy motorized blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows smoothly descended, plunging the room into a focused cinematic dimness. A split second later, the massive digital presentation screen covering the entire back wall flared to life. It illuminated the faces of every board member with a stark, blinding white light. Marcus turned around, expecting to see his forged prenuptial agreement projected for everyone to scrutinize. Instead, the screen displayed a highly detailed, incredibly complex forensic financial audit. If we are going to discuss fiduciary duty and the protection of corporate assets, I began, my voice slicing through the dark room with absolute lethal clarity. Then we should start by looking at where the actual leaks in this company are coming from. I swiped a finger across my control panel. The screen zoomed in on a web of offshore transactions and shell companies. For the past 6 months, Marcus has been presenting himself to this board as an independent investment consultant handling our brand expansion. I continued standing up and pacing slowly around my side of the table. He requested a discretionary budget to explore boutique lifestyle partnerships. I am sure you all remember approving those funds. The board members nodded slowly, their eyes locked on the scrolling data. What you did not approve, I said, tapping the screen to bring up a new slide, was the creation of a fraudulent supply chain. The screen shifted to display the colorful aesthetic logo of Brittany's Bohemian Wellness brand. Beside the logo were rows of banking statements, wire transfers, and inventory manifests. Marcus has been systematically funneling millions of dollars in corporate capital directly into his stepsister's lifestyle brand, I explained, watching the color begin to drain from Marcus's face. Brittany claims to sell holistic healing crystals and organic sage. But according to these inventory manifests, her tiny online shop has supposedly purchased and sold over $4 million worth of inventory in the last 90 days. That is physically impossible for a brand with her social media reach and shipping capacity. Gregory frowned, leaning forward to squint at the numbers. What exactly are you implying, Jada? He asked, his voice losing its previous arrogance. I am not implying anything, Gregory, I stated firmly. I am providing you with irrefutable proof of a federal crime. Brittany's lifestyle brand is nothing but a shell. It is a money laundering front. Marcus has been pushing stolen corporate funds through her fake inventory purchases to wash the money dry, pulling it out clean on the other side to avoid detection from the Internal Revenue Service and my own accounting team. The boardroom erupted into chaotic, panicked gasps. Money laundering was not a domestic dispute. It was a fast track to federal prison. Gregory and William instantly pushed their chairs back from the table, physically distancing themselves from Marcus, as if he were suddenly radioactive. Their loyalty to him had been bought with promises of easy money, but it evaporated the second they realized he was dragging them into a felony conspiracy. Marcus started sweating profusely. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. "This is a fabricated audit. I was investing in legitimate real estate expansion. I was building a new portfolio for the hotel chain." I smiled, shaking my head with mock sympathy. "You always did have a terrible habit of overplaying your hand, Marcus. Let us take a look at this brilliant real estate portfolio you built for us." I swiped the control panel one final time. The forensic audit vanished, replaced by a high-resolution photograph of a breathtaking, ultra-luxury penthouse condominium located directly on the pristine beaches of Miami. The property was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring wraparound glass balconies and a private rooftop pool. Beside the photograph, a certified property deed materialized on the screen. Marcus lunged forward desperately, reaching out as if he could physically wipe the image off the digital display. "No, wait!" he shouted, sheer terror radiating from his body. "That is a corporate retreat. I bought that for executive use. It is a company asset." I did not let him finish the lie. I cut him off with a sharp, commanding tone that echoed off the boardroom walls. "Do not insult my intelligence and do not insult this board," I snapped. "That deed is strictly in your name, Marcus, purchased fully in cash using the $4 million you washed through your sister's fake company. But you did not buy it as a corporate retreat. And you certainly did not buy it for yourself." I tapped the screen, bringing up a series of crystal-clear security stills taken from the building's lobby camera. The photos showed Marcus walking arm in arm with a stunning, much younger woman. In every single photo, he was carrying her designer shopping bags, opening doors for her, and kissing her cheek. The executives at the table gasped collectively. "You bought that multi-million-dollar Miami penthouse for your mistress?" I announced, my voice ringing with cold, absolute finality. "You used my money, my hotels, and my corporate capital to set up a hidden life for a woman who has been living rent-free on a private beach. And judging by the prenatal vitamins on her credit card statements and the very obvious physical evidence in these photos, she is currently 6 months pregnant with your child." The boardroom completely exploded. The polished professional atmosphere I had meticulously maintained for the past 5 years vanished in a single second. Executives were shouting over each other, their heavy leather chairs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Marcus stood at the far end of the table, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant, untouchable aura he had walked into the room with was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a man watching his entire life burn to the ground. He looked at the high-resolution images of his pregnant mistress on the massive digital screen, and then he looked at me. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. "That is not what it looks like," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that echoed pathetically across the room. He tried to project confidence, but his vocal cords betrayed his absolute terror. "Jada, you are taking this completely out of context. She is just a friend. She is a business associate who needed a place to stay. I was simply helping her relocate." Before I could even dignify that pathetic, insulting lie with a response, the heavy boardroom doors swung open again. Brittany marched into the room, flanked by the security guards who had apparently given up trying to contain the chaos. She must have been waiting in the executive lobby, ready to pop champagne the moment Marcus successfully ousted me from my own company. But one look at the giant screen displaying her brother kissing his pregnant mistress, and one look at the furious faces of my board of directors, told her the corporate coup had failed. But instead of retreating, Brittany fell back on her absolute favorite strategy. She weaponized her delusion. She pushed her way past the stunned executives and stood shoulder to shoulder with Marcus, lifting her chin in a display of supreme, unearned arrogance. "You are twisting the truth," Jada Brittany announced, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. She looked directly at the board members, attempting to play to their sympathies with a deeply manipulative performance. That woman is not his mistress. She is a surrogate. Marcus had to seek alternative family planning methods because Jada selfishly refused to prioritize giving him a family. He was doing this for us to build a legacy. He was going to surprise you with the baby. The sheer audacity of her lie was breathtaking. I let out a low, dark laugh that instantly silenced the shouting executives. A surrogate, I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the cold, air-conditioned room. A surrogate who happens to be wearing a $50,000 diamond tennis necklace and driving a custom imported sports car, all while living in a $4 million beachfront penthouse. That is a very generous compensation package for a medical procedure, Brittany. I tapped my glass control panel again. The screen transitioned from the photos of the mistress to a highly classified internal accounting ledger. And if Marcus was simply building a beautiful family legacy, I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register, then perhaps Gregory and William would like to explain why they personally funded her designer wardrobe. Gregory and William both froze, their faces instantly draining of all color. "What are you talking about?" Gregory demanded, his voice trembling as he stared at the digital display. I zoomed in on the ledger, highlighting 3 specific columns in bright red. "I did not just audit the corporate reserve funds," I explained smoothly, standing up to command the full attention of the room. "When I discovered the money laundering front Marcus established through Brittany's fake wellness brand, I ordered my forensic accountants to run a full sweep of every single executive account connected to this board. Marcus did not just steal my money to fund his hidden life. He knew my security protocols would eventually catch a massive hemorrhage of capital. So to cover his tracks and supplement his lavish lifestyle, he skimmed directly off the top of the quarterly shareholder dividends. Specifically, he targeted the private dividend accounts belonging to the 2 board members who trusted him the most." The screen displayed a terrifyingly clear trail of wire transfers. Marcus had systematically siphoned over $850,000 directly out of Gregory and William's personal retirement portfolios over the last 3 quarters. He had routed their money through the exact same offshore shell companies to pay for his mistress's luxury vehicles, her weekly shopping sprees, and the private yacht charters he proudly posted on social media. Gregory stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open in pure horror. William gripped his chest, looking as though he might actually collapse right there in the boardroom. The men who had been ready to strip me of my title and hand my empire over to Marcus just 5 minutes ago were now looking at him like he was a monster. "You stole from us!" William whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute unfiltered rage. "We backed your play. We vouched for your business strategy against our own chief executive officer. And you were stealing our money to buy sports cars for your pregnant girlfriend." Marcus backed away from the table, raising his hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. "William, please, it was just a temporary reallocation of resources," Marcus pleaded, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking the collar of his shirt. "I was going to pay it back with the profits from the hotel expansion. I swear I was going to make you whole once I took over as the head of the company." Gregory lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his wrinkled suit. "You are going to federal prison, you parasitic thief," Gregory roared, entirely abandoning his professional composure. "I will spend every dime I have left making sure you never see the outside of a jail cell." The remaining board members shouted in agreement, calling for security to lock down the building and contact the authorities immediately. The corporate takeover was officially dead, and Marcus was about to be served up on a silver platter to federal investigators. But Brittany, realizing that her brother's golden ticket was gone, and her own freedom was now in jeopardy, due to her involvement in the money laundering front, resorted to the absolute lowest tactic in her playbook. She stepped between Gregory and Marcus, her face contorted with vicious, unadulterated spite. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "You think you have won, Jada?" Brittany screamed over the chaos, her voice carrying a venomous, desperate threat. "You think you can just embarrass us and walk away with your perfect, shiny reputation? If you do not call off these dogs and give us our 50% right now, I am making one phone call to my grandfather. I will drag your precious black excellence narrative through the dirt. I will go to every major news outlet in this country and paint you as an angry, fraudulent diversity hire, and I will personally destroy your stock. The absolute silence that fell over the executive boardroom was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with a sudden toxic tension. Brittany stood near the head of the table, her chest heaving with exertion, her fingers still pointed directly at my face like a loaded weapon. The venom in her voice hung in the air, a blatant, racially charged threat designed to strip me of everything I had built. She was weaponizing her maternal family connections, relying on her grandfather, a man who controlled massive media syndicates across the Southeast. She knew exactly how the media worked, and she knew how eager certain outlets would be to tear down a successful independent Black woman. Gregory and William, who had been screaming for Marcus to be arrested just seconds prior, suddenly exchanged a terrified, calculating glance. The threat of a coordinated high-level public relations nightmare was enough to make their corporate survival instincts kick into overdrive. They knew that in the hospitality industry, public perception was just as valuable as liquid capital. If a media conglomerate painted their chief executive officer as a fraudulent diversity hire, the stock prices would plummet immediately. The institutional investors would pull their funding, and the brand would become toxic overnight. Brittany could see their hesitation. She lowered her hand and crossed her arms, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. She felt completely untouchable, shielded by the protective cloak of her lineage and her privilege. Marcus watched the executives waver, and he instantly recognized the lifeline his stepsister had just thrown him. The sheer panic that had melted his arrogant facade moments ago was quickly replaced by a desperate, calculating calm. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and visibly straightened his wrinkled suit jacket. He took a deep breath, trying to physically project the authority he had completely lost. He stepped up beside Brittany, squaring his shoulders and adopting a tone of forced, manipulative diplomacy. "You heard her," Jada Marcus said, his voice dropping into a smooth, persuasive cadence that made my stomach turn. "We absolutely do not have to do this the hard way. You have spent your entire adult life meticulously building this image of the flawless, self-made Black woman. You are the poster child for minority success in the corporate world. You are on the covers of magazines. You speak at universities. Think about what a vicious, coordinated media circus will do to that carefully curated legacy." He walked closer to my end of the table, his eyes locked on mine, trying to gauge my reaction. He mistook my absolute stillness for fear. He actually believed he had finally found the ultimate leverage to break me. "If Brittany makes that phone call," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "the press will not care about forensic audits or offshore bank accounts. They will not care about the actual truth. They will only care about the scandal. They will paint you exactly how she just described. They will frame you as an aggressive, bitter, unstable woman who fabricated an elaborate financial audit just to ruin her husband out of spite. The market hates instability, Jada. The stock will completely tank before the closing bell rings today. Your investors will demand your immediate resignation, and you will lose the company anyway." Gregory cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. "Marcus might have a point, Jada," Gregory muttered, his cowardice returning in full force. "A public scandal of that magnitude, backed by her grandfather's media network, could cause irreparable damage to the shareholder value. We have to consider the brand." Marcus smiled, feeling the momentum shift back in his favor. He placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaned toward me. "I am offering you a graceful, dignified exit," Marcus proposed, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "Call off the legal hounds right now. Tell the board that this forensic presentation was just a misunderstanding over temporary budget reallocations. We will process the prenuptial agreement quietly right here in this room. You transfer the 50% ownership of the assets to me, and we dissolve the marriage peacefully behind closed doors. You get to keep your title as Chief Executive Officer, you keep your pristine reputation, and your brand remains completely intact. No media smear campaigns, no federal investigations into my accounts. We all walk away with exactly what we want, and nobody has to get hurt." He looked so incredibly proud of himself. He really thought he had orchestrated the perfect blackmail scheme. He believed that my fear of falling victim to racist media tropes would override my demand for justice. He thought I was more attached to the optics of my empire than the actual foundation of it. Brittany stood behind him, nodding in agreement, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. They were a pair of parasites threatening to burn the host alive unless they were given half of its lifeblood. I looked at Marcus. I looked at his desperate face, then at the two cowardly executives who were considering letting a federal criminal walk away with half my company to avoid a bad news cycle. I thought about the thousands of hours I had sacrificed. I thought about the sweat, the tears, and the relentless grind it took to build my wealth. And then I started to laugh. It did not start as a loud or hysterical sound. It started low in my chest, a slow, dark, chilling vibration that rumbled through the quiet boardroom. It was a laugh utterly devoid of humor, filled entirely with lethal, terrifying amusement. The sound echoed off the glass walls, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a scythe. Both men flinched. Brittany's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. Marcus took a physical step back from the table, his eyes widening in sudden gripping fear, as the slow, chilling sound of my laughter completely silenced the room. The echo of my laughter finally faded into the high ceilings of the boardroom, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Marcus and Brittany stood frozen at the head of the table. The smug satisfaction that had plastered their faces just a moment ago was completely gone, replaced by a creeping, undeniable sense of dread. They had played what they believed was their ultimate trump card. They had threatened my reputation, my legacy, and my identity as a successful Black woman, assuming I would instantly fold to avoid a public scandal. They thought I was so terrified of the media tearing down my image that I would quietly hand over half of my empire to a parasite and a racist. I slowly stood up, placing both hands firmly on the polished wood of the conference table. I looked directly into Marcus's wide, panicked eyes. "You really thought you had it all figured out," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal whisper that made the entire board hold their breath. "You honestly believed that the threat of a bad news cycle would force me to surrender the wealth I bled for. You thought my pride was a liability you could exploit to secure a lifetime of unearned luxury. But you forgot the most fundamental rule of business, Marcus. I did not build this empire by operating on emotion, and I certainly do not negotiate with terrorists." I reached down to my leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I unclasped the heavy brass locks and pulled out a massive, dense legal binder. It was over 4 inches thick, bound in dark leather, and stamped with the unmistakable golden crest of the largest international corporate law firm in the country. I hoisted the binder up and dropped it onto the mahogany table with a resounding, heavy thud. With a swift, deliberate push, I sent it sliding all the way down the slick surface. It glided past the terrified executives and slammed directly into Marcus's hands. He instinctively grabbed it, clutching the heavy document to his chest, as if it might physically burn him. "Open it!" I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for hesitation. "Go ahead, Marcus. Take a very long, very careful look at the exact future of the company you are so desperately trying to steal from me today." He fumbled with the thick leather cover, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the first page. Brittany leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the dense legal jargon, desperately trying to comprehend the massive volume of text. I watched the exact moment his brain finally processed the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the executive summary. His jaw practically unhinged. "What is this?" Marcus breathed out, his voice nothing more than a hollow, terrified rasp. I smiled, stepping away from my chair and pacing slowly toward his end of the table. "That is an executed merger and acquisition agreement," I announced, making sure my voice carried to every single board member in the room. "You see, while you were busy forging a fake prenuptial agreement and buying a penthouse for your pregnant mistress, I was in Paris doing exactly what a chief executive officer does. I was closing a highly lucrative deal, but I was not acquiring a new property. I was selling." 3 days ago, my legal team officially sold the entire brand, the intellectual property, the trademark, the proprietary software, and every single operational asset of this hotel chain to an international multi-billion-dollar hospitality conglomerate. The deal is completely finalized, the ink is dry, and the massive capital has already been securely transferred into a private, impenetrable offshore trust that you cannot even sneeze at. The remaining executives gasped in pure disbelief. Gregory and William looked as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath them. "You sold the company," William choked out, gripping his chest. "You sold everything without a board vote." I turned to look at the cowardly executives. "I retained an absolute 75% voting power when I built and founded this organization from scratch, William. I did not need your permission to sell my own creation. But do not worry, your golden parachutes were included in the acquisition. You will be bought out and safely retired by the end of the week." "But Marcus," I continued, turning my lethal gaze back to my soon-to-be ex-husband. "You are in a very different position entirely. Because you see, the international conglomerate only bought the assets and the brand. They did not buy the original corporate holding entity. They left that behind." Marcus stared at me, his eyes glassy with unspeakable terror as he finally realized what he was holding. "The company you just demanded 50% ownership of, the company you just presented forged documents to control, is now nothing more than an empty, worthless shell. There is absolutely no money left in it, Marcus, but there is a massive, inescapable liability attached to it. You see, your little money laundering operation with Brittany triggered an automatic massive red flag with the Internal Revenue Service. Because you forged your signature as a primary executive to wash $4 million through a fake wellness brand, the federal government just slapped this empty holding shell with a $10 million tax penalty for corporate fraud. And since you just stood in this room in front of 7 witnesses and aggressively claimed 50% ownership of this entity, you are now legally on the hook for that entire $10 million federal tax debt. The walls are permanently closing in on you, Marcus, and your own fraudulent signature just securely locked the cage from the inside. You tried to burn my legacy to the ground to keep yourself warm. Now you are going to burn in the ashes of your own absolute greed. I suggest you start looking for an incredibly good defense attorney." 1 week had passed since I dropped that $10 million anchor onto Marcus's chest. Most men would have taken that time to secure legal counsel, pack their bags, and quietly prepare for a federal indictment. But Marcus and Brittany were not most people. They were parasites facing extinction, and parasites will always try to find a new host before they starve to death. Instead of accepting the catastrophic reality of their situation, they decided to double down on their own delusion. Drowning in an inescapable tax penalty and absolute denial, Marcus managed to scrape together a final hidden line of credit under his sister's name. He used every single cent of it to rent out the grand ballroom of a historic downtown Atlanta venue. They sent out heavy embossed gold leaf invitations to the wealthiest, most elite investors in the city. The event was billed as a high-profile charity gala, ostensibly raising funds for urban development and community growth. But in reality, it was an incredibly desperate, highly orchestrated scam. Marcus was attempting to play the role of the newly appointed chief executive officer of my former empire. He planned to stand in front of Atlanta's elite and pitch them on a massive fake expansion project for the hotel chain I had already sold. He was going to collect their investment checks under the guise of an exclusive equity buy and cash them immediately, and flee the country with Brittany and his pregnant mistress before the investors or the federal government realized they had bought into a phantom company. To pull off this spectacular fraud, they spent a fortune on appearances. They hired a classical string quartet, ordered imported caviar, and poured bottomless premium champagne to keep the potential victims intoxicated by the illusion of wealth. The ballroom was packed with billionaires, professional athletes, and powerful local politicians. It was a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, all gathered under the glittering light of massive crystal chandeliers. They had transformed the historic space into a playground for the rich, ensuring that every detail screamed of stability and corporate triumph. Brittany was playing the role of the philanthropic visionary, floating through the wealthy crowd in a designer dress she had undoubtedly purchased on that final maxed-out line of credit. She was using her carefully practiced innocence and her maternal family connections to legitimize Marcus to the older, more skeptical investors in the room. She smiled sweetly, clinked crystal glasses, and spun a fabricated narrative about how Marcus was taking the hospitality brand in a more refined, elevated direction now that the supposedly unstable former leadership was out of the picture. She leaned in close to deep-pocketed real estate developers, whispering confidentially about the aggressive restructuring they had planned. They were selling a lie built entirely on the foundation of my stolen reputation, leveraging the very brand they had tried to destroy. Marcus stood near the main stage, sweating slightly under the bright lights, but projecting a desperate, forced confidence. He was shaking hands, laughing too loudly at unfunny jokes, and signaling waiters to keep the drinks flowing. He had set up sleek digital presentation boards around the perimeter of the room, displaying glossy architectural mock-ups of the fake hotel expansions. He was selling them properties that did not exist, using marketing materials stolen directly from my old corporate hard drives. It was an elaborate, incredibly expensive piece of theater designed to separate rich fools from their money, and for the first hour of the evening, the illusion was actually working. But their biggest expense that night was not the food, the venue, or the string quartet. It was the security detail. Marcus had hired a formidable private security firm to lock down the entire perimeter of the historic building. He gave the head of security a strict, non-negotiable directive. They circulated a high-resolution photograph of my face to every single guard stationed at every single entrance. I was to be denied entry under any circumstances whatsoever. If I showed up, the guards were instructed to physically restrain me, remove me from the premises, and immediately call the police to have me arrested for criminal trespassing. Marcus was absolutely terrified of me. He knew that if I stepped foot inside that ballroom, his entire house of cards would instantly collapse into dust. He knew I held the power to shatter his fragile illusion and expose him as a federal criminal in front of the most powerful people in the city. He spent the entire evening glancing nervously at the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, silently praying that his security barricade would hold. He thought he had successfully isolated himself in a fortress of borrowed luxury. He believed that if he could just make it through the next 2 hours, if he could just get those investors to sign their checks and commit their funds, he would have enough liquid cash to escape the terrifying consequences of his actions. He was so focused on keeping me out that he failed to realize I was never planning to sneak in. I did not need a formal invitation to a party funded by my own stolen equity, and I certainly was not going to let a team of rented security guards stand between me and the final act of this reckoning. I wanted to look him dead in the eye when the reality of his total destruction finally set in. I wanted him to be surrounded by the very elite society he was so desperate to impress when the absolute truth came crashing down on his head. As Marcus tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, stepping up to the microphone to begin his fraudulent presentation, the atmosphere in the room shifted to one of quiet anticipation. The wealthy investors turned their attention to the stage, completely unaware that they were being lined up for a slaughter. Marcus adjusted his tie, his chest puffed out with that same unearned arrogance he had displayed on my front porch a week ago. He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the pitch of his life. He felt invincible. He felt like he had finally won. He had absolutely no idea that I was already pulling up to the curb outside, ready to tear his entire world apart. The heavy, humid air of the Atlanta night wrapped around the historic downtown venue, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate lies. My private driver, David, eased the black sport utility vehicle to a flawless halt right at the edge of the velvet ropes. Through the tinted window, I could see the glow of the flashbulbs and the barricade holding back a crowd of curious onlookers. Marcus had truly spared no expense on his final pathetic masquerade. He had hired valets in crisp white jackets to open doors for billionaires and politicians, setting a stage built entirely on the fragile foundation of my stolen corporate equity. David stepped out, circled the massive vehicle, and opened my door. I did not just step out of the car. I descended into the night like a localized weather event. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored crimson gown. It was a masterpiece of structural silk that draped perfectly across my skin, catching the ambient streetlights and radiating absolute unapologetic power. The color was intentional. In a sea of safe, predictable black tuxedos and muted designer dresses, I was a walking, breathing warning sign. I was the blood Marcus was trying to bleed from my empire, returning to collect the ultimate debt. I glided past the valets, my heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence against the pavement. The grand entrance was heavily guarded by the private security firm Marcus had emptied his sister's final credit line to hire. I could see the immediate shift in their posture as I approached the velvet ropes. The lead guard, a massive man with a coiled earpiece, squinted at me in the dim light. Recognition hit him instantly. He reached into his jacket, likely touching the printed photograph of my face Marcus had circulated with strict orders to keep me out at all costs. The guard raised his broad hand, stepping directly into my path to block the ornate double doors leading to the lobby. "You are not on the guest list." The guard barked, his tone aggressive and loud enough to draw the attention of the straggling guests waiting at the coat check. "You need to turn around and leave the premises immediately, or we will physically remove you." I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride, and I certainly did not acknowledge a rented obstacle. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy oak doors. Just as the guard reached out his thick hand to grab my bare shoulder, a synchronized, flawless physical interception took place. From the shadows of the unmarked vehicles trailing behind my sport utility vehicle, my own personal security detail materialized. These were not local bouncers working an hourly wage. These were highly trained elite corporate extraction specialists that I retained for hostile international acquisitions. 5 men in immaculate dark suits moved with terrifying silent precision. 2 of my men effortlessly folded the lead guard's arm behind his back, neutralizing his threat, and pressing him against the stone pillar without a single shout or scuffle. The other 3 fanned out, forming an impenetrable moving wedge around me, smoothly pushing the rest of Marcus's rented security team completely out of the way. It was a masterclass in superior force. Marcus had paid for a barricade, but I had brought a wrecking ball. I glided right through the center of the incapacitated guards, completely untouched and entirely unbothered. I reached out, placing my manicured hands on the polished brass handles of the grand ballroom doors, and pushed them wide open. The heavy doors swung inward with a dramatic, echoing thud that instantly cut through the polite chatter of the room. The transition from the quiet lobby to the glittering, expansive ballroom was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of Atlanta's most powerful elite. The classical string quartet was playing a soft, elegant melody in the far corner. Waiters balanced silver trays of premium champagne, weaving through tight clusters of wealthy real estate developers, professional athletes, and influential city officials. But the exact moment I crossed the threshold, the entire atmosphere of the room violently shifted. The vibrant crimson silk of my gown caught the chandelier light, pulling every single eye in the room directly to me. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. The sheer, undeniable aura of authority I projected rippled across the ballroom like a physical shockwave. I was not a guest. I was the architect of the industry they were all currently standing in. Many of these billionaires and politicians had sat across from me at high-stakes negotiation tables. They knew my face. They knew my brand. And they knew instantly that my dramatic arrival was not a planned part of Marcus's evening. The sea of wealthy investors instinctively parted as I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, creating a wide, unobstructed path leading directly to the main stage. Up on the brightly lit stage, Marcus was standing in front of a sleek digital presentation board, displaying fake architectural renderings of a hotel expansion that would never exist. He had a wireless microphone clipped to his lapel, his hands gesturing expansively as he fed his expensive poison to the eager crowd. Brittany was seated at a reserved table just below the stage, smiling her sickeningly sweet fabricated smile while nursing a glass of sparkling water. But as the profound silence swept over the room, Marcus stopped speaking. He looked down at the crowd, confused by the sudden terrifying drop in their attention. His eyes followed the parted sea of guests scanning the long aisle until his gaze slammed directly into mine. I watched the arrogant, triumphant glow completely vanish from his face, replaced by a raw, suffocating terror. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. The microphone in his hand trembled, picking up the ragged, panicked sound of his own breathing. He had spent his last dime trying to build a fortress to keep me out, and I had simply walked through his walls as if they were made of paper. Down below him, Brittany turned around in her chair. When she saw the crimson gown and the absolute lethal calm on my face, she let out a sharp, audible gasp. She gripped the edge of her table, her carefully constructed posture collapsing into pure, unadulterated panic. They were frozen under the bright stage lights, trapped in front of the most powerful people in the city. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and absolutely no way to stop the reckoning I had just brought to their front door. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. You could hear the subtle rustle of my crimson silk gown brushing against the imported carpet. Up on the brilliantly lit stage, Marcus was completely paralyzed. His knuckles were white as he gripped the sleek wooden podium, his breathing shallow and rapid. Down below him at the reserved table, Brittany was already scrambling. Her instinct for self-preservation kicked in, overriding her initial shock. She shot up from her chair, her designer heels scraping loudly against the floor, and began waving her arms frantically toward the back of the room. She was signaling the hired sound engineers stationed at the control booth. "Cut the microphone," she mouthed aggressively, pointing at me and slashing a hand across her throat. "Turn off the floor mics right now." She assumed I was going to march up to the stage, grab a microphone, and cause a hysterical, emotional scene. She was still operating under the delusional belief that she could silence me by simply cutting off my amplification. I did not even look at the floor microphones positioned along the aisles. I did not need their equipment to deliver my message. I stopped walking when I reached the exact center of the room, positioning myself perfectly among the wealthiest and most influential investors in Atlanta. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I held it up in my right hand, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light of the ballroom. I locked eyes with Marcus, giving him one final second to realize that his absolute destruction was not coming from my voice. With a single deliberate tap of my thumb, I bypassed their rented audiovisual network. My corporate cybersecurity team had already breached their incredibly weak local server hours ago, granting my phone master control over the entire digital presentation system. I did not just interrupt his pitch. I hijacked the entire venue. Behind Marcus, the massive digital presentation board was displaying a gorgeous fabricated architectural rendering of a luxury resort expansion. Suddenly, the image violently flickered. A harsh burst of static hissed through the towering surround sound speakers, making several guests jump in their seats. The fake architectural mock-ups completely vanished, plunging the stage into a momentary, terrifying darkness. Marcus spun around, his mouth dropping open in pure panic as he stared at the blank wall. "What did you do?" he hissed into his lapel microphone. I did not answer him. A split second later, the massive screen flared back to life. It was no longer projecting glossy, stolen marketing materials. Instead, it was displaying crisp, incredibly clear 4,000 pixel resolution video footage. The angle was wide, captured directly by the hidden high-definition security camera I had secretly installed inside the living room of the luxury Miami penthouse. The very same penthouse Marcus had purchased with stolen funds for his pregnant mistress. The date and timestamp flashed in the corner of the screen, proving the video was recorded just 48 hours ago. The audio kicked in, broadcasting with crystal clear, undeniable fidelity through the massive concert speakers surrounding the stunned ballroom. On the giant screen, Marcus and Brittany were sitting on a plush white velvet sofa, drinking premium champagne and laughing loudly. The investors in the ballroom collectively gasped as they recognized the two people on the stage, now towering above them in high definition. "I need you to play the innocent society girl perfectly tomorrow night," the digital version of Marcus said on the screen, taking a lazy sip of his drink. "These Atlanta investors are rich, but they are incredibly gullible. If you smile and drop our grandfather's name a few times, they will practically throw their checkbooks at us." Digital Brittany laughed, tossing her hair back dismissively. "It is going to be so easy," she replied, her voice dripping with venomous arrogance. "We just pitch them, the fake expansion projects, collect the initial equity buy-ins, and wire the cash straight to the offshore accounts." The real Marcus, standing on the stage, let out a strangled, horrified noise. He lunged toward the presentation board, desperately waving his hands as if he could physically wipe the digital projection away. "Turn it off!" Marcus screamed, tearing the lapel microphone from his jacket and throwing it to the floor. But my security team had already secured the audio-visual booth. The video continued to play mercilessly, broadcasting their entire criminal conspiracy. On the screen, Marcus leaned closer to Brittany, grinning wickedly. "We are going to walk away with at least $20 million in clean cash," Marcus bragged on the video. "And when the federal government finally realizes the hospitality holding company is just an empty shell carrying a $10 million tax penalty, Jada will be the one drowning in investigations. She built the empire, but we are going to cash it out. They will eat up the narrative that she is an angry diversity hire who tanked her own brand." The collective intake of breath from the elite crowd was deafening. The billionaires, real estate tycoons, and politicians standing around me stared up at the screen in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were listening to Marcus explicitly outline exactly how he planned to steal their money, pack it into offshore accounts, and flee the country. The glossy, sophisticated illusion Marcus and Brittany had spent their last dime to create was entirely incinerated in less than 60 seconds. The investors realized simultaneously that the exclusive equity buy-in they were about to sign checks for was a total, unmitigated scam. The room shifted from stunned silence to a dangerous, boiling outrage. Up on the stage, Marcus was physically trembling. He looked out at the furious faces of the most powerful people in the city, men and women who could destroy his life with a single phone call. He was trapped under the blinding stage lights, completely exposed as a parasitic fraud and a federal criminal. Down below him, Brittany had collapsed into her chair. Her face was buried in her hands, her weaponized fragility entirely useless against the undeniable proof of her own malicious greed. They had tried to lock me out of my own victory. Instead, they had locked themselves inside an execution chamber of their own making. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my crimson gown glowing like a warning fire, watching the absolute destruction of my enemies unfold flawlessly on the massive screen above. The collective shock that held the grand ballroom in a suffocating grip finally shattered. The absolute silence was instantly replaced by a deafening roar of outrage. The wealthy elite of Atlanta do not take kindly to being made fools of, and they certainly do not tolerate anyone attempting to steal their money. The polished veneer of high society completely dissolved in a matter of seconds. Real estate tycoons, who had been sipping premium champagne just moments before, were now slamming their crystal glasses down on the cocktail tables. The elegant string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing, packing up their instruments, as the atmosphere shifted from a sophisticated charity gala into a volatile and dangerous mob. I stood perfectly still in my crimson gown, a silent observer in the center of the storm I had just unleashed. I watched as dozens of furious investors began surging forward, abandoning their polite restraint and marching directly down the center aisle toward the main stage. "Give us our checks back right now!" A prominent local politician shouted, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "You are a fraud and a thief." Other voices immediately joined the chorus of demands. Billionaire developers who had proudly handed over massive equity buy-in checks earlier in the evening were now storming the steps of the stage. They demanded their funds be returned immediately. They threatened to unleash their own aggressive legal teams to dismantle whatever was left of Marcus and his fake enterprise. The sheer volume of their collective fury echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the historic venue. It was a terrifying display of raw, concentrated power, turning against the very man who had tried to harness it. Up on the stage, Marcus was drowning in his own manufactured catastrophe. Sweat poured down his forehead in heavy sheets, soaking the collar of his tailored tuxedo shirt. His chest heaved as he backed away from the advancing crowd of angry investors. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. He was completely cornered, trapped under the blinding stage lights, with nowhere to run. Desperation completely overrode his common sense. He scrambled across the polished wooden floor of the stage, his hands blindly searching for the lapel microphone he had thrown down just minutes ago. His fingers found the small device, and he practically ripped it from the wire, gripping the main handheld microphone from the podium instead. "Listen to me!" Marcus screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical frequency that blasted through the venue speakers. "You have to listen to me. Please, everyone just calm down and look at me. That video is not real. It is a complete fabrication." The angry crowd did not slow their advance, but their shouting dipped just enough for his desperate lies to echo through the ballroom. "It is an artificial intelligence deepfake," Marcus bellowed, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated panic. He gestured wildly toward the massive digital screen behind him, which had now frozen on a highly incriminating frame of him and his pregnant mistress. The technology these days is incredibly advanced. Anyone can manipulate a video to make it look like someone is saying something they never said. You are all smart investors. You know how digital media can be manipulated. That is not me on that screen. He turned his wild, desperate eyes directly toward me, pointing his shaking finger at my crimson silhouette standing in the center of the room. "She did this!" Marcus shouted, his voice dripping with venom and terror. "Jada is a bitter, jealous ex-wife who cannot handle the fact that I am taking this hospitality brand to new heights without her. She could not stand to see me succeed, so she hired cybercriminals to create this fake video to ruin my legitimate business expansion. She is trying to tear down my legacy out of pure spite. Do not let her angry, vindictive lies trick you into walking away from the most lucrative real estate opportunity of the decade." It was the ultimate pathetic display of a cornered parasite. He was throwing every single excuse at the wall, hoping that his appeal to their greed would somehow blind them to the irrefutable truth. But the elite investors in that room were not fools. They had seen the crisp 4,000 pixel resolution of the footage. They had heard the exact unmanipulated cadence of his voice planning their financial ruin. They were not buying the deep-fake excuse for a single second. The crowd surged closer to the edge of the stage, their demands growing louder and more aggressive. Realizing that his technological excuse was failing miserably, Marcus resorted to his final, most insidious tactic. He turned to Brittany, who was still cowering at her reserved table, just below the stage edge. He reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and practically dragged her up onto the stage to stand beside him. Brittany stumbled, her designer heels slipping on the polished wood, her face streaked with ruined makeup and genuine tears of terror. Marcus pushed her forward physically, using her as a human shield against the fury of the predominantly white elite crowd. "If you will not trust me, then trust her," Marcus pleaded into the microphone, his voice dropping into a manipulative begging register. "Look at Brittany. Look at her family name. You all know her grandfather. You know the integrity of her lineage. She comes from one of the most respected, established families in the South. Do you honestly believe a woman of her pedigree would involve herself in a federal scam?" He was weaponizing her whiteness and her unearned privilege in front of an audience of her peers. He was desperately hoping that the wealthy white investors would look at her pale, tear-stained face and instinctively choose to protect one of their own. He wanted them to believe that the angry, aggressive black woman in the red dress was the real villain, and that the weeping white woman on stage was an innocent victim of a vicious smear campaign. "Please, you have to believe us," Brittany sobbed into the microphone, taking her cue and amplifying her weaponized fragility to its absolute limit. "We are just trying to build a beautiful community project. Jada is just trying to destroy us because she is hostile and unstable. You cannot let her ruin our family." I stood perfectly still watching their disgusting calculated performance unfold. I did not need to shout. I did not need to defend my character. I just watched as the wealthy crowd stared up at the stage, completely unmoved by the theatrical display of tears. The investors looked at Brittany, then they looked back at the frozen image on the massive screen behind her. The image where she was explicitly mocking them and planning to steal their money. Her tears could not wash away the undeniable proof of her own malicious greed. The final desperate illusion had completely failed, and the real consequences were about to arrive. Brittany stared at the massive digital screen, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the severity of her crimes. The wealthy investors surrounding the stage were no longer listening to Marcus and his pathetic excuses. The room was practically vibrating with the collective fury of the Atlanta elite, and Brittany knew that her grandfather's name could no longer protect her from the mob she had tried to scam. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She weaponized her tears perfectly. Her face crumpled into a mask of absolute hysterical panic. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her voice cutting through the shouting crowd like a siren. "Arrest her!" Brittany screamed, tears streaming down her pale face as she looked frantically at the security guards, who were already backing away from the stage. She hacked into a private corporate network. She stole our personal data and committed a massive cybercrime. She is an unstable, dangerous woman, and you all need to call the police right now and have her thrown in jail. She stood on the edge of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably, begging the wealthy white investors to look at her as a victim of a vicious, coordinated cyber attack by an aggressive black woman. It was a calculated performance built on centuries of systemic bias, a desperate final attempt to shift the focus of the room onto me. Marcus immediately latched onto her performance, realizing it was his absolute last lifeline. He grabbed Brittany by the shoulders, pulling her close to his chest and glaring out at the furious crowd. "You heard her," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "Jada committed a federal cybercrime just to ruin a charity gala. She illegally breached our privacy. You are all witnessing a severe violation of the law. You cannot trust anything she projects on that screen because she is a criminal herself." I remained standing in the exact center of the ballroom, completely untouched by their frantic screaming accusations. I did not attempt to defend myself against the cybercrime allegations. I did not need to explain that as the sole legal owner of the corporate holding shell they were currently pretending to operate, I possessed full legal authority to access any network associated with it. I simply watched the performance, my crimson gown catching the light of the chandeliers, my expression a mask of lethal, unbothered serenity. The wealthy real estate developers and politicians in the room were not swayed by the tears. They had just watched high-definition footage of a money-laundering conspiracy that directly targeted their checkbooks. Brittany's sobbing could not erase the fact that she had just been broadcast mocking their gullibility. The investors pushed closer to the stage, their voices rising into a deafening roar of demands and threats. Just as the tension in the grand ballroom reached an explosive, terrifying peak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the venue violently burst open. The sound was so sudden and so forceful that it instantly silenced the shouting investors. Everyone in the room turned their heads simultaneously, expecting to see the local Atlanta Police Department arriving to handle a massive corporate dispute. Marcus let out a sharp, audible gasp of relief, clearly believing his rented security team had finally managed to summon local authorities he could manipulate with his smooth-talking victim narrative. But the men striding through the grand entrance were not local beat cops. They did not wear standard blue uniforms, and they did not look remotely interested in listening to a domestic dispute. A tactical team of federal agents flooded the ballroom. They wore dark suits and heavy tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, radiating an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. The wealthy investors instantly parted, stepping back to create a wide, clear path for the federal authorities. Walking right directly behind the lead agent was Patricia, my high-powered corporate attorney. She looked like a financial grim reaper in a tailored black suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase, and wearing a smile of pure surgical satisfaction. The lead federal agent did not stop to ask any questions. He did not look at the crowd of angry billionaires, and he bypassed me entirely, not even glancing at my crimson gown as he marched straight down the center aisle. He walked directly up the wooden steps of the main stage, his heavy boots echoing in the stunningly quiet room. Brittany practically threw herself toward him, her tear-stained face looking up in desperate relief. "Thank God you are here!" Brittany cried out, reaching her hand toward his tactical vest. "That woman in the red dress just hacked our system. You have to arrest her right now." The lead agent did not even blink at her tears. He smoothly stepped around her outstretched hand, pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and grabbed Marcus by the wrist. Marcus Vance and Brittany the agent announced, his voice booming across the silent ballroom with devastating clarity. "You are both under arrest for federal wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement." Marcus let out a strangled, breathless sound as the cold steel clamped down harshly around his wrists. His legs gave out entirely and he collapsed onto his knees right there on the stage, the reality of his total destruction finally crushing the air from his lungs. Brittany let out a blood-curdling shriek as a second agent grabbed her arms, spinning her around to place her in handcuffs. She thrashed and screamed wildly, her weaponized fragility completely useless against a federal indictment. The ultimate scam had failed, and they were finally paying the ultimate price for their absolute greed. Their illusion of superiority entirely evaporated under the massive, crushing weight of the American justice system today. The heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked shut with undeniable finality that echoed through the silent ballroom. The entire room of wealthy Atlanta elites stood paralyzed, watching the collapse of the man who had just tried to swindle them out of millions. Marcus knelt on the polished wooden stage, his expensive custom-tailored tuxedo bunching awkwardly around his shoulders as his arms were pulled tightly behind his back. The arrogant posture he carried all evening was gone. He was physically trembling, his chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths as the federal agents secured the restraints. Down on the floor just below the stage, Brittany sobbed hysterically. Her white privilege, which she had wielded like a weapon her entire life, had finally hit a brick wall of federal authority. She screamed for someone to call her grandfather, demanding the agents release her because she was innocent. But nobody in the room moved a single inch to help her. The investors she tried to scam simply looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Marcus looked up from the stage floor, his eyes darting wildly around the room until they finally locked onto me. I was still standing in the center of the ballroom, a solitary figure draped in vibrant crimson silk, completely untouched by the chaos surrounding him. When our eyes met, whatever remaining shred of dignity he possessed evaporated. The realization that he was about to lose his freedom, his stolen wealth, and his carefully crafted identity broke his mind in real time. Tears began streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. Snot ran from his nose as he started to loudly, uncontrollably sob. It was the most pathetic display of desperation I had ever witnessed. "Jada," he wailed, his voice cracking and echoing through the venue speakers that were still turned on. "Jada, please! You have to stop them. You have to tell them this is a mistake." He struggled against the grip of the federal agents, trying to pull himself forward on his knees toward the edge of the stage. He was no longer the smug parasite who had locked me out of my own home. He was a terrified, cornered animal begging for his life. "Please, Jada. I am sorry." Marcus sobbed, tears falling freely onto the stage floor. "I made a mistake. I was stressed. I was trying to build something for us. We have been married for 5 years. We built a life together. I am your husband. You know me. You cannot let them take me away like this. Please, I am begging you, help me." He was weaponizing our history, desperately trying to trigger any lingering sense of loyalty or duty I might have felt toward him. He thought that if he cried hard enough, if he played the role of the broken, remorseful husband, my natural instinct as a Black woman to protect my family would override my demand for justice. He wanted me to save him from the consequences of his own malicious greed. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold surgical satisfaction. I slowly walked forward, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The wealthy investors parted silently, giving me a wide, clear path to the stage. The federal agent standing over Marcus saw me approaching. Patricia, my attorney, gave the lead agent a subtle nod. The agent stepped back just half a pace, granting me the physical space to address the man who tried to destroy my life. I stepped up onto the stage. I walked over to where Marcus knelt in his ruined tuxedo. I did not tower over him. I did not scream or raise my voice for the audience. Instead, I gracefully lowered myself down, bending my knees so that the crimson silk of my gown pooled elegantly around my feet. I brought my face perfectly level with his, close enough to smell the stale champagne and the sour stench of his fear. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, foolishly hoping he was about to hear words of forgiveness. He leaned in, waiting for a lifeline. I kept my voice at a soft, intimate whisper, a whisper designed solely for him, but sharp enough to slice straight through his soul. "You asked for your $3,000 allowance?" I whispered softly, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. "I sent it, Marcus." He blinked, a flicker of profound confusion breaking through his panic. "But I did not send it to you." I continued, my voice dripping with lethal, icy precision. "I sent it directly to your pregnant mistress in Miami. And along with that money, I sent her the irrefutable, heavily documented proof that you were planning to throw her completely under the bus for the $10 million federal tax debt. I showed her the emails where you told your lawyers she was just a disposable asset." Marcus stopped crying. His breath hitched in his throat as the blood drained from his face. "She is a very smart woman, Marcus," I whispered, watching his eyes widen in pure horror. "She realized you were setting her up to take the fall for your money laundering. So she took matters into her own hands. She used the authorized access you so foolishly gave her and drained every single cent out of your hidden offshore accounts. She took everything you stole from Gregory and William. And then she boarded a private flight and fled the country this morning." I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, making sure my final words etched themselves permanently into his mind. "She is gone, Marcus. The money is gone. You do not even have public defender money left." I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my crimson gown with absolute, unbothered grace. I looked down at him one last time, observing the total catastrophic destruction of a man who thought he could outsmart me. The realization hit him with the force of a falling building. His mistress had betrayed him. His stolen millions were gone. His sister was going to federal prison with him. He had absolutely nothing left. He had burned down his entire life for a fortune that no longer existed. Marcus threw his head back and let out a raw, guttural wail of pure agony. It was a terrifying, soul-shattering scream that echoed off the crystal chandeliers and bounced against the historic walls of the ballroom. He sobbed uncontrollably, his body shaking with violent tremors as he finally understood the absolute, inescapable finality of his ruin. The federal agents grabbed him by the arms, hauling his sobbing, broken body off the stage floor to drag him out into the waiting police cruisers. I simply turned my back, walking away from his agonizing screams without a single ounce of regret. The heavy, ornate doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open as the federal agents hauled Marcus and Brittany out into the humid Atlanta night. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching the final, pathetic remnants of their fabricated empire crumble under the harsh glare of reality. The local press, tipped off by an anonymous source from my legal team, had already swarmed the entrance of the venue. The moment Marcus and Brittany were pushed through the doors, a blinding storm of camera flashes erupted. Reporters shouted questions, thrusting microphones into their tear-stained faces. Marcus kept his head down, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed into the collar of his ruined, custom-tailored tuxedo. Brittany looked like a ghost, her designer dress wrinkled, and her carefully constructed society girl facade entirely shattered by the heavy steel handcuffs binding her wrists. The wealthy investors who had filled the ballroom just an hour ago now stood by the massive windows, watching the spectacle with expressions of absolute disgust. They were watching the permanent neutralization of a parasitic threat. There would be no bail for Marcus. The federal evidence against him was far too overwhelming, and his hidden offshore accounts were completely empty. He had tried to steal my throne, and in return, I had handed him a federal prison sentence. I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers reflect against the glass doors as they drove away, taking the absolute worst mistake of my life with them. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt incredibly light, completely purged of their toxic, suffocating greed. I closed my eyes, letting the chaotic sounds of the sirens and the shouting reporters wash over me. And as I slowly opened them again, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers smoothly morphed into the warm, flickering orange glow of a modern fireplace. The deafening noise of the crowded gala venue seamlessly faded away, replaced entirely by the smooth, deep, bass, heavy rhythm of a rhythm and blues track playing softly from my hidden surround sound speakers. I was no longer standing in the center of a chaotic ballroom. I was back exactly where this entire story began. I was sitting comfortably on the plush, white leather sofa in the center of my quiet, dimly lit Atlanta penthouse. The heavy structural silk of my crimson gown draped beautifully across the cushions. The massive glass balcony doors were slightly ajar, letting in the cool, peaceful night breeze from the glittering city skyline below. My home was finally truly my own again. There were no uninvited guests throwing glasses against my walls. There were no entitled relatives demanding access to my bank accounts. There was only absolute undisturbed peace. I reached out to the sleek glass coffee table and picked up a heavy crystal glass filled with a vintage full-bodied red wine. The exact same wine Marcus had tried to steal from my cellar just a week ago. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark liquid was rich and complex, tasting like pure, unadulterated victory. I lowered the glass, resting it gracefully on my knee, and I looked directly forward. Society loves to tell women, and they especially love to tell Black women, that we must endure absolute agony simply to keep our families together. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that our strength is strictly measured by how much dead weight we can carry on our backs without collapsing. The world looks at a successful, driven, self-made woman and immediately tries to convince her that her ultimate purpose is to be a life raft for a man who is simply too lazy to learn how to swim. We are told to be the ride or die partner. We are told to hold our men down, to fund their illusions of grandeur, to swallow our pride, and to shrink our own massive accomplishments just so their fragile egos do not feel threatened by our light. We are expected to smile through their financial abuse, to forgive their blatant disrespect, and to silently write the checks that fund their secret betrayals. Marcus believed those societal rules applied to me. He thought my dedication to the optics of Black excellence would force me to silently absorb his theft. He truly believed that I was so terrified of being labeled a failure in my marriage that I would allow him to siphon the lifeblood out of the empire I built with my own 2 hands. He thought my brilliance, my relentless work ethic, and my millions were just a subsidized luxury intended for his personal consumption. He mistook my quiet grace for a lack of boundaries. He mistook my financial generosity for a permanent, irrevocable weakness. But let me make something incredibly clear to anyone who is listening. You do not owe your peace, your sanity, or your bank accounts to a person who refuses to contribute to your growth. Your success is not a community fund for toxic relatives, and your heart is not a rehabilitation center for broken, manipulative men. You have the absolute right to protect the life you built with the exact same ruthless precision you used to build it. Do not ever let society guilt you into shrinking your empire just to make a parasite feel like a king. Never let your brilliance become a subsidized luxury for a man who brings absolutely nothing to the table except the audacity to demand a plate. I took one final slow sip of my wine, letting the smooth music playing in the background swell just a fraction louder. I looked straight ahead, my gaze sharp, steady, and unapologetically victorious. And if a man ever looks you in the eye and threatens you with a divorce, do not cry. Do not beg him to stay. Do not apologize for working hard. You look him right back, you secure your assets, and you beat him to the courthouse.